Well, kalispera, yasus. I would like to echo Luciana in that it's always a real pleasure to come to Athens for so many reasons. I mean, obviously there's the food, the drink, the music, and then I have the pleasure of wonderful company. So thank you, Robert. It's always great to be here. However, I'm a little bit annoyed that I was scheduled to speak after Robert, because he's a really hard act to follow. His enthusiasm, charisma, and general entertainment value is something that I can't possibly hope to replicate. So thanks for that, Robert. Okay, often when I come to these kinds of conferences, I talk specifically about the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, because that's the organization that I work for. And although I will share some data related to number of certificates and that kind of thing, this is not a BACB talk. This is a general talk about my views and my experience of trying to establish training programs around the world. So that's the context of this talk. And really the BACB context is such that the explosion in the growth of behavior analysis training programs around the world has probably not occurred because of the BACB, but has occurred because of a growing interest in the professionalism of the field, particularly in terms of training applied behavior analysts. And of course, a lot of that relates to individuals who are working with individuals with developmental disabilities and autism. So if we looking at the history of credentialing, this is not a new phenomenon. In fact, the first discussions about professionalizing the field started in the 1970s. So that, that's quite a while ago. So there was a certification program in a number of different states, eventually culminating in the BACB starting a national certification program, which very rapidly became an international certification program. In one of the very early discussions related to this, in 1972, at a conference in Kansas that was subsequently published, Thomas pointed out that as the field continues to grow, we can no longer dismiss lightly mundane issues such as standardized training programs and licensing. And the days when it was possible to be on a first-name basis with all of the behavior analysts is rapidly disappearing. Now, the point at which I started attending these kinds of conferences, it still felt like you could be on a first-name terms with many of the greats in the field. But we have expanded hugely since that point. So in 1974, there was a specific conference that it was addressing professional issues related to training behavior analysts. In 1975 to 1976, the Midwestern Association for Behavior Analysis, which actually became the Association for Behavior Analysis, which actually then became the Association for Behavior Analysis International, had a convention on this subject. And they actually formed a committee and started to talk about having certification in the United States anyway. And that started in 1978. However, the Minnesota program predates that. And that came into existence to address specific needs of individuals who are working within the state disability system, so individuals working with developmental disabilities. And your qualification based on this program, and then therefore where you worked, was on the basis of tests that were multiple choice testing and job performance evaluation. And they actually came up with a number of different designations. Now, I'm struggling to read that, so I'm sure you are too, but we have in hierarchical order technician, senior technician, Specialist, Senior Specialist, Behavior Analyst 1, Behavior Analyst 2, and Behavior Analyst 3. So this was in 1975 or thereabouts. For the technician, it says entry level, requires supervision and direction. That's the first one. The last one, Behavior Analyst 3, also says entry level, because having any kind of qualification like this is only a demonstration of minimal competence to meet the requirements to get into the field. So for Behavior Analyst 3, it says entry level, skilled professional able to operate without regular supervision or feedback. And then it lists the skills that a behavior analyst was supposed to have at that point. Now, the next state to start to think about these issues was in Florida. They had a certificate program. And interestingly, the way you qualified to get a Florida certificate was on the basis of a 2-day written examination. Now, that doesn't sound a lot of fun, does it? And that involved open-ended questions, and you had to be 90% correct. Now, a big problem with having that kind of rigor, and certainly with open-ended questions, is the problem with lack of objectivity. It's very difficult to score open-ended questions in a very specific, consistent way. They also included a direct observation of competence following the exam, and perhaps not surprisingly, this only led to a couple of dozen certificates being handed out. Yamas. The Association for Behavior Analysis International also had a certification program that started in 1978, but eventually there was a recommendation to discontinue it because of the lack of objectivity involved in how people were actually assessed. And actually, they didn't end up offering any certificates. The Florida certification program then introduced more rigor, and they had what they called certified behavior analysts and certified associate behavior analysts. This program was based on what then became the BACB task list. So this program was based on the first edition task list. And unfortunately, I don't have a copy of that, but it exists in various ring-bound folders that are that long on someone's shelf. So it was a huge document. And how one got the certification, at least initially, was through multiple choice items and some free response items. Then they eliminated the free response items because of the issues with subjectivity. And eventually they started to add additional requirements that you had to meet before you could take the examination. In 1998, they reviewed the task list. The task list, for those of you that have not seen any of those, are essentially a list of the knowledge, skills, and abilities that behavior analysts are supposed to have. And these, and I should also say that those are defined by the field, not by, in this case, Florida, and subsequently not by the BACB. The field decides. And in 1998, they produced a second edition task list, and that was the point at which they handed off to the BACB, and the first exams were based on the Florida examination and the second edition task list. But before that happened, Florida program expanded out into various other states. So Oklahoma used it, and then later California, Texas, Pennsylvania, and New York. And in 1998, there were various discussions within the US and at conferences, and it became very clear that so many states were interested in pursuing certification, and probably more importantly, so many organizations and individuals were kind of coming out of the woodwork and purporting to offer behavior analytic services, that it became the right time for some kind of national certification program that everyone ought to adhere to. But then, as I said, that grew very quickly into an international program as more of us showed an interest in that. Growth was pretty slow at the beginning. I'll show you some of the data shortly. But in 2011, the BACB office was still located in Florida, in Tallahassee, and there were 6 employees. And in 2011, we reached the 10,000 certificate mark. And I remember there was much celebrating in the office at the time. They couldn't believe that the number had risen to 10,000. Leaping forward to 2019, the BACB outgrew the tiny space in Tallahassee, Florida. So we started to look for where we could have a bigger and better base. And the 2 options were Austin, Texas, or Denver, Colorado. And I have to say, my money was in Austin, Texas, mainly for the music scene. But it was decided that Denver, Colorado was a better bet for all sorts of reasons. And this is our lovely building. And as of a few weeks ago, we now have over 110,000 certificates. That's phenomenal, right? Although most of them are in the US, and I'll show those data with you shortly. Now, since I've been working for the BACB, which is 4.5 years now, these are the countries that I have interacted with, either because they have contacted me to start something, or there's been some other connection. So a significant number of countries interested in pursuing this. These are the ones that I have visited over the last 4.5 years, which just seems like a crazy number. These are the ones that currently have training programs that offer coursework towards BACB certification, which is a very specific difference to, for example, just a university program teaching behavior analysis. Although there are surprisingly few now university programs that teach behavior analysis that are not verified course sequences, an exception, yes. And you're one of them. There are 2 training programs in Greece, although I think one has never been operational, and the other one is quite local in Calathea. These are the ones highlighted in light blue that I have personally helped start, and these are the ones that I have taught on before it became clear that teaching as an employee of the BACB was a potential conflict of interest. And not teaching anymore is something I miss tremendously, because it's a highly reinforcing activity. Hey, Robert. Okay, so I said we had 110,000 certificates. That includes the registered behavior technician. These are just the numbers for BCBAs and BCABAs worldwide. So around 36,000. Many, many more BCBAs than BCABAs. And that's probably, well, there's a number of reasons for that. One is that many BCABAs go on to become BCBAs, but also in many organizations don't really have positions for BCABAs. Now, look at the y-axis, right? It goes from 0 to 40,000. Here's what it looks like outside of the United States. So 0 to 4,000. So unfortunately, outside of the United States, we are significantly fewer, about 9% of the total. And we are distributed like this. Now, the countries I've highlighted are the ones that currently have more than 100 certificates, which are not very many, and Greece currently has 16. Now, there are many countries on this list, but there are very small numbers in many of these countries. And that has, I suppose, generated prompts for help from me and others, where I have emails from lone behavior analysts in particular countries that say, help. I'm kind of paraphrasing, but essentially, you know, I'm here on my own, you know, what do I do? And often what I suggest is that they have a conference and promote the many, many things that behavior analysts can offer. Okay, so just to put this in context, and by the way, I should say I showed this slide or something very similar last month in Moscow. Robert was there and he came up to me afterwards and chastised me for not correctly highlighting that the US is also comprised of Alaska and Hawaii. So I've corrected that because I knew Robert would be sitting in front of me. So those red blobs, rather than that red blob, are the United States. And 91% of certificates are currently in the United States, and if you include Canada, 95% of certificates are in the US and Canada, leaving only 5% of the rest of us outside. And actually, 95% of the world's population live outside the United States. So there's a significant anomaly in these figures. Out of, I suppose, curiosity and to follow up on a review that had been done 10 years previously, some colleagues and I looked to see whether the publications in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis kind of mirrored what was happening around the world in terms of the populations of behavior analysts. And specifically, we were interested in how many publications were coming out of non-US institutions and from non-US authors. And sadly, the answer was not very many. So actually, in the top graph shows that only 6% of authors were non-US, and only 9% of articles were non-US. That's the middle graph. So the numbers kind of mirror quite well the distribution of certificates around the world. Now, one reason why that may be the case is because no countries outside the United States currently recognize behavior analysts, or at least apply behavior analysts, as a profession in their own right, as a group of professionals in their own right. With some growing exceptions. The Czech Republic is an odd example because it only has 2 or 3 behavior analysts, as I think I showed just now. But the Czech government now funds behavioral intervention for autism through medical health insurance, and they have a master's program in behavior analysis, and applied behavior analysis is written into statute as a recognized profession. However, there's much hostility from the medical profession and from psychologists against that, which is very unfortunate. And they're a very small number indeed. So how that happened in the first place is something of a mystery. Indeed, I was in the Czech Republic several years ago, and we presented a conference in the Czech Parliament building, and then we had a meeting with the Minister of Education afterwards to really bombard him with information and to suggest that they ought to recognize behavior analysis. And it was quite a large meeting. I think there were 12 of us in the room, and we all went around the table and we said something for a couple of minutes. And the minister was as bored as I think I've ever seen anyone. He was constantly looking at his watch, looking up at the ceiling. And then eventually, when we'd all said something, he said, "Okay, so what do you want?" And we were unprepared for that. So the professor of Masaryk University, who was also in the room, said, "Well, as you've asked, money." And the minister said, "How much?" Which we were also unprepared for. So the professor said, "Oh, I don't know, 500,000 euros, which he just kind of plucked out of thin air. And the minister kind of looked up at the ceiling and he went, "Okay." And that was it. Meeting finished. And that money was used to set up the first master's program in behavior analysis in the Czech Republic. It was used to send 5 people overseas to train and then come back. So that was pretty impressive, but very, very unusual. In Spain, if you are a BCBA, you automatically meet requirements to be registered as a psychologist in Spain. In the UK, we are pursuing recognition through an organization called the Professional Standards Authority, and that application will go in soon, probably within a few months. And if it is successful, and we have been told we are likely to be successful, then behavior analysts will be a recognized profession in their own group in the UK. And then that might have a natural kind of cascading effect in other countries, or at least I hope it will. There are, though, a number of countries that are pursuing their own form of standards and certification. So in Brazil, Israel, Italy, and some others. And there are some countries like Brazil, like Japan, who have a very long-standing tradition of training basic and experimental researchers, but with a slow but growing interest in applied behavior analysis. Now, some of the challenges, there have continued to be many organizations, individuals, schools, centers, and so on, that on the back of the interest in working with children with autism, using behavioral intervention, are starting these schools and centers and saying, hey, we offer some kind of ABA intervention. And in the absence of knowing where these people got their training, and often they did not, it's very difficult to ensure that they are competent, that they are ethical, perhaps even safe. So that's a huge challenge for us, I think, around the world. There are also huge differences in relation to ethics, and I have quite a funny example that I'll share with you later. There's a huge discrepancy between countries in terms of things like salaries and resources. There's a huge discrepancy between countries and regions within countries around what constitutes an evidence-based intervention or evidence-based practice. And I've had so many arguments with people who try to explain to me that, you know, sensory integration is an evidence-based practice, for example, and it's not. There are huge discrepancies in terms of priorities. Somewhere like India is not going to invest in training behavior analysts when much of the population don't have access to clean water, for example. And there are also huge discrepancies around the world in terms of legal systems and access to data and privacy laws and all that kind of thing. In fact, we had an issue a few years ago with the new European privacy laws, I can't remember what it is, the anyway, it doesn't matter. But it allows people in the Republic of Ireland to request the data on any examination they've taken, including the questions and including the answers to go with the questions. Now, that's a massive problem for us, because if we hand over the questions and the answers to those questions from our examination bank, we'll have to retire those questions. We can't use them anymore. And so the outcome of that was, at least temporarily, we are unable to test in Ireland, which is a shame. Okay, some other global issues and some cultural issues. We live in a world where there is an increasingly elderly population. It's very different to 20 years ago, very, very different to 50 years ago. So individuals are living longer, and that provides a challenge to us in terms of working with them and addressing issues such as dementia, stroke, general health problems, and so on and so forth. I know some individuals who work in this field, but it's a relatively underutilized specialist area, working with elderly individuals, behavioral gerontology. Of course, now we have a huge increase in migrant populations around the world, so there's a lot of movement. Here's some data I pulled from 2017 that shows where the largest numbers of international migrants are. The biggest population of migrants is in the United States, and that provides a challenge to those who work in the United States in terms of addressing the different cultural needs and possibly language needs and other issues related to working with these populations. So that's a big challenge. Of course, there is a close relationship between cultural norms and expectations and social validity, and that can be quite challenging at times. Just to give you a flippant example of how things can vary across countries, I was in Tokyo a few years ago, and it was a work-related trip, but I have a good friend who lives in Tokyo. And because he's a good friend, we can argue, and we can do it quite enthusiastically. And we were arguing, in fact, we were having the Skinner-Chomsky debate on the Tokyo metro system, because he's a linguist, and I'm not. And after a few minutes, I realized that we had been completely, everyone had stepped away from us, and they were just staring at us, because that's not what you do in a Tokyo metro system, and probably not what you do in Japan in public either. So that was quite entertaining. Also, issues related to sleeping. I have worked with some parents who are concerned about their children not sleeping on their own when they're 6 months old. I have worked with some parents who are complaining to me that their 15-year-old son is still sleeping with them, which is a problem, right? Expressions of pleasure and delight and gratitude after eating are also fairly diverse. Yeah, public expressions of opinion, hence my example in Tokyo. Now, a few years ago, we conducted a survey of BACB certificates just to find out where people were working, and not surprisingly, around 2/3 profess to work in or with individuals with autism, mainly children. And so that's what the majority of our certificates do. And of course, there are a number of cultural and global issues related to autism-specific issues. For example, there are many countries that continue to promote non-evidence-based practices, things like dietary supplements, psychodynamic psychotherapy, the use of witch doctors. More recently, perhaps you saw in the news, someone was, or some organization was suggesting that drinking bleach is the way to treat children with autism. I mean, not concentrated bleach, but still, I mean, you know, utter nonsense. And that provides a massive challenge for those of us that are trying to do this good work in these different places. People's explanations for the etiology of autism also vary widely. Of course, if you go back to Bruno Bettelheim, it was because the mothers were cold, right? The refrigerator mothers. But I still hear people say, oh, well, there's nothing you can do, it's just God's will that he or she is like that. Or, you know, he or she has the evil eye, or sometimes they have a special gift, and there's nothing you can do. I mean, this is, you know, it's God's will, so back off. And that's a shame. And related to, I suppose, Bruno Bettelheim's claim about refrigerator mothers, I still meet parents, particularly mothers, who say, well, I know there's, you know, it's not, you know, it's probably not true, but I do feel it's my fault still. You know, there's something I should have done or could have done. Okay. And some cultures, for example, the Hispanic culture, would rather rely on family support than they would on having professionals come into the home and work with their individuals, the kids. And some countries simply do not have descriptors for what we refer to as autism. A few years ago, a non-work related trip, which is fairly rare for me, I was in India, and I was with someone who was actually teaching me tabla, which is a kind of Indian drum. And I didn't know him very well, and he was asking me about what I did, and at the time I worked in London at a school for children with autism. I think it was the first ABA school in the UK. And he asked me what that meant, and so he said, oh, we don't have autism in India. And I went, Yes, you do. And a few days later, I saw, I mean, okay, I don't know whether they had a diagnosis of autism or not, but I saw someone engaging in some stereotypic behavior. And I pointed this out to my friend, and he went, oh yeah, we have loads of people like that. Okay, well, there remains, as you could see by the list of the numbers of individuals that have had some kind of training in these different countries, a shortage of qualified and credentialed practitioners, and indeed training programs, and a lack of funding and resources to address that point. There's a lack of peer-reviewed publications in languages other than predominantly English. Is there a Greek journal? No. And some countries will actively eschew publications other than in their own languages, such as Japan. Now that's an issue, I suppose, for, I mean, it's difficult to teach someone behavior analysis when, other than some very rare resources in that language, they're not really going to have access to journals and textbooks and so on, and that's a big problem, I think. Of course, you have a Greek textbook. And to reach some of these more remote areas that don't have access to any kind of services, there's an increased use of telehealth, but huge variability in the kind of technology required to support that. You know, as simple as, you know, losing the internet connection, as happens fairly frequently. I was having a conversation with someone in Sierra Leone a few weeks ago, and it was a 10-minute conversation, and we lost connection probably 6 or 7 times during the, and that was just a 10-minute conversation. That wasn't even a kind of supervision session or anything like that. There's a lack of research to support the efficacy of evidence-based practices across different cultures. And indeed, some people have come up to me and said, the BACB probably ought to include some competencies around cultural sensitivity and cultural awareness into the task list. And my personal view about that is that it's not a behavior analytic competency. And actually, however you work, whether you're a behavior analyst, a psychologist, a speech language therapist, a doctor, and so on, if you work in different countries and cultures, then you should have some kind of cultural training, but that's not a behavior analytic competency specifically. And in any case, we do have this code that specifies where differences of age, gender, race, culture, ethnicity, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, disability, language, or socioeconomic status significantly affect our work, then we should get some training and experience to address that. Some of you may be familiar with the BACB code, ethics code. The one code I think that's always problematic, and people always come up to me and moan about, is the code that essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, says that we shouldn't accept or give gifts, right? And there are some countries or cultures where that's just not going to work. And this might be one of them, yeah. I mean, in China, not accepting a gift would be way, way more problematic than accepting it. And here, you say. I was at part of the group that came up with the code, and we were arguing about this, and someone in the group who's very black and white, and who shall remain nameless, but you can ask me later if I have a glass of wine in my hand. We were saying, well, you know, come on, what if you go to the house and someone offers you a cup of coffee? What if you go to someone's house and they offer you a glass of water? And he banged his hand on the table and he went, you know what? Bring your own damn water. Now, my view on that is, well, firstly, coffee is kind of like essential. Anyway, and in any case, no one's going to complain about me taking a cup of coffee in Greece or China. And if they did, I would argue this. I would argue that I'm sensitive to the cultural contingencies in that country, and that's why I accepted the coffee. Right? Plus I need coffee. Okay, now one of the reasons why I think there's such a discrepancy between the numbers of behavior analysts, at least certified behavior analysts in the United States, and so few elsewhere, is that what really generated the growth in the United States were two main things, really. First, the fact that you can now claim reimbursement for behavioral intervention for autism through medical health insurance. Right, that's a huge driver, and that didn't happen until the kind of mid-2000s, maybe around 2000 and slightly later. The second is licensure, and most licensure requirements in the United States start with the requirement that you have a professional qualification, you know, a BCBA or BCABA. Now, these things don't exist outside the US at the moment. So perhaps not surprisingly, the growth is a lot slower because we haven't, those drivers are absent at the moment. Another problem is that the standards have continued to evolve since they were started in 1998, at least with the BACB. And they have continued to evolve in the context of provision in the United States. And even in 1998, when the requirements were way lower than they are now, significantly fewer coursework hours were required, the degree requirement was a lot lower, the experience requirement was kind of poorly defined. Even then, growth was slow until the advent of reimbursement and licensure. And so it seems almost unfair to impose these current rigorous standards on countries that are really going to struggle to meet them. And that's another reason why I think things are growing very slowly. Yes, the perceived Western centrism of the ethics code, but I think the only issue there is the gifts one, and I think I've just addressed that. Now, if you want to become a BCBA or a BCABA, you have to take an examination. And there are not as many secure test sites around the world as we would like them to be. We use an organization called Pearson View, and they offer computer-based testing. And there are 3 levels of Pearson View test site. The level 1 is owned by and run by Pearson View, and that's our preference to use those. Level 2 is run by Pearson View, but not owned by Pearson View, and we use those. Level 3 are just third-party sites, and we don't use those because they're very insecure, they're unsafe, the risk of losing examination questions through theft is high, the lack of security in terms of people turning up and the identity checks they do is very poor, and so on. And that has severely limited some countries' access to the examination, which I think is very unfortunate.
We have a test center.
Yeah, you do. But they have none in Russia and none across the continent of Africa at the moment. Now, yes, and acceptable practices in terms of testing vary considerably. Take this, for example. This is a school in India. It's in Bihar state. And the students are taking a very important examination that determines many things like access to university, getting access to good jobs and so on. And whilst the students are taking this examination inside, their friends and family are handing them the answers through the window. And here too. Now, what's interesting, I found this in CNN. There were very rigorous security protocols in place for the students. So when the students walked into the room, they had to take their shoes off and they had checked them. But yet they're not stopping their friends and family scaling the building and handing them the answers. Okay, now as a resource to the field, we thought it would be useful, when I say we, the BACB, so me and a couple of colleagues there, we thought it would be useful to put together a standardized lexicon of terms which then could be used as the basis of translations, which then could be used as the basis for translating things like textbooks, journal articles, and the examination and so on. And we had a number of existing lists that had been just given to us by individuals who put them together, such as Robert. And so we had all of these different lists, and they were all slightly different. You know, they had different terms on them. And what we wanted to do was generate one definitive list, and then if people wanted to translate those, we would give them that one list and they would translate those. And I'm still waiting for yours.
Almost done.
Yep, okay. So what we did is we took those terms from all of those lists and we put them together in a spreadsheet. And then we also took terms from these major textbooks. And then I sorted them alphabetically, I removed the duplicates, and we had over 3,000 terms. And then we went through a series of rigorous discussion and exercises where we would take out what we saw as redundant terms, take out what we saw as not truly behavior analytic terms, take out terms where other terms also existed, so that multiple terms for the same thing. And then we sorted them into 3 areas: concepts and principles, measurement and experimental design, and applied behavior analysis. And then we sent those out to subject matter experts, and we asked them for their view on whether they agreed with what was in the list, they thought anything should come out, there were other things that they wanted to add. And after all of that, we ended up with a list of 587 terms from 3,000 plus. And if you're interested, that is, you can access that on the BACB website. There's a link right at the bottom, it says documents, and you can just follow the links and you will find it from there. Okay, now as other considerations with regard to translation, I've been involved in a couple of projects where we have translated behavior analytic terms. The first was with Spanish colleagues, and it was a topographical consideration of translation. So what we did is we started with the English term, and then removed any that were redundant based on consensus opinion from the group, and then looked for a lexemic equivalent if there was one, and if there wasn't, a non-lexemic equivalent. And if there wasn't, we looked at some kind of phrase that would best encapsulate that term. If we had to, we would use some kind of integrated Anglicism, and if that wasn't possible or practicable, then we used a non-integrated Anglicism. Now, we published that in 2015. Now, a couple of years later, there were 2 separate projects going on translating behavior analytic terms into Russian. And the 2 projects were translating the BACB exam into Russian, and then separately translating the book Applied Behavior Analysis by Cooper, Heron, and Hewitt into Russian. Right? You've heard of that textbook, some of you. Now, I wanted those 2 groups to work together because it seemed crazy to me that there would be 2 separate groups working on important translation projects and possibly doing it differently and coming out with different translations for terms. So I tried to encourage these 2 groups to work together, and they wouldn't for some reason. Now, I happened to be in Moscow for a conference anyway, and I went to meet with the team that were translating the Cooper, Heron, and Hewitt book with Bill Hewitt, who was also with me. And the project was being led by a physiologist who was a very keen behavior analytics scholar, and he'd read everything that you could possibly think of. And he gave us a presentation on how they were carrying out the translation. And in the context of this presentation, he was telling Bill Hewitt how he had wrongly used terms in his textbook, which I thought was quite funny and quite cheeky. And so the conversation went something like this. He would say, hey, Bill, on page 387, you used the term auto-shaping or something. And you reference Skinner. But if you go back and read Skinner, Skinner actually borrows, this is an example, if you go back and read Skinner, Skinner actually borrows the term from Pavlov, and if you go back and read Pavlov, not the English translation, but the original Russian, Pavlov meant this, and that's why we're translating it that way. Now that's very difficult to argue with, that's a very scholarly way of translating, whereas the team that were translating the examination, their rationale for translating certain words were, well, we did it that way because it sounds nicer in Russian. So that's a very different approach to translation. So essentially I had my team work with the White Book team and said that you have to do it that way, I'm sorry. It makes much more sense. And then we published a paper about it, and there were three processes that we eventually used to translate the Russian terms. And this was from a functional perspective rather than from a topographical perspective. And it was based on three main considerations. The first is that we should try and preserve any kind of historical succession if one existed. And so that involved things like looking at the origin and the exact meaning of the term, even if you had to go back and read Thorndike or Pavlov or Watson or something. And then the second issue was, given the overlaps between some of these terms, try and preserve interdisciplinary compatibility if there was such. I mean, for example, did you know that the terms equivalence, transitivity, reflexivity, and symmetry come from Cantor's set theory, 1874? Here are some of the fields that have some compatibility. And then the third consideration was try and maintain the uniqueness of the term if you possibly could. And of course, Skinner used a lot of neologisms in his work, you know, things like manned, tact, and they're very difficult to translate without resorting to a phrase or a sentence or multiple phrases and sentences, and therefore we concluded that it might, in many cases, be better to retain the original term than even attempt to translate it. A few years ago, I was involved in a European project. The context was autism intervention. We called it Science and the Treatment of Autism, a multimedia resource pack for parents and professionals. The acronym was STAMP. And the purpose of this project was to provide a set of materials, an easy to understand booklet that described key behavior analytic terms and concepts, and also to give examples of some key elements of teaching with some nice exemplar video clips. And so we did that, and we have had that also translated into these different languages. Okay, final thoughts. The world needs more behavior analysts. Right? God damn it. I mean, it's so sad that the world doesn't realize that it needs more behavior analysts, and that it doesn't realize that there are so many things that we could and should be turning our attention to. And I guess it's also, well, I was going to say sad, but it's something of a double-edged sword that many people now have heard of ABA because of the connection to autism intervention, which is fantastic, right? And we do great work in that area. But it's also sad because so many people misperceive that applied behavior analysis is just that. It's all about working with kids with autism. You know, I still have what you would imagine to be sensible academics and professors from other disciplines go, oh yeah, ABA, that's that stuff for children with autism. It drives me crazy. The world really needs more behavior analysts. I kid you not. However, given how many countries are struggling, they really need to start thinking about developing their own infrastructure so that they can, even if they end up developing their own standards and experience requirements, because you know, honestly, meeting the current rigorous standards for many countries is going to be very, very difficult to in the short term and even in the long term. And that may necessitate countries having initially to import expertise to start with the training and the supervision, but then in order to generate the infrastructure and gradually fade out such that they can become self-sufficient. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.